This is Lecture 2 of the lecture cycle by Rudolf Steiner entitled The Kingdom of Childhood. Lecture 2 was given in Turkey on August 13th, 1924. I pointed out yesterday how the child's development undergoes a radical change with the loss of the first teeth. For, in truth, what we call heredity or inherited characteristics are only directly active during the first epoch of life. It is, however, the case that during the first 7 years, a second life organism is gradually built up in the physical body, which is fashioned after the model of the inherited organism. This second organism is completed at the changing of the teeth. If the individual who comes out of the spiritual pre-earthly world is weak, then this second life organism is similar to the inherited one. If the individual is strong, then we see how in the period between the change of teeth and puberty, from 7 years till about 14, a kind of victory is gradually achieved over the inherited characteristics. Children become quite different, and they change even in their outward bodily form. It is especially interesting to follow the qualities of soul that now reveal themselves in this second life epoch. In the first epoch, before the change of teeth, the child can be described as being wholly, quote-unquote, sense organ. You must take this quite literally, wholly sense organ. Take, for example, the human eye or ear. What is the characteristic of such a sense organ? It is that the sense organ is acutely sensitive to the impressions of the outer world. And if you observe the eye, you can clearly see what kind of process takes place. The child, during the first 7 years, is really completely and wholly an eye. Now, consider only this thought. In the eye, a picture is formed, an inverted picture of every external object. This is what ordinary physics teaches everyone. What is outside in the world is to be found within the eye as a picture. Physics stops here, but this picture-forming process is really only the beginning of what you should know concerning the eye. It is the most external physical fact. If physicists looked at this picture with a finer sense of observation, they would see that it determines the course of the circulation of the blood in the choroid. The whole choroid is conditioned in its blood circulation by the nature of this picture within the eye. The whole eye adjusts itself according to these things. These finer processes are not taken into consideration by ordinary physics. But the child, during the first 7 years, is really an eye. If something takes place in the child's environment, let us say, to take an example, a fit of temper when someone becomes furiously angry, then the whole child will have an internalized picture of this outburst of rage. The etheric body makes a picture of it. From it, something passes over into the entire circulation of the blood and the metabolic system, something that is related to this outburst of anger. This is so in the first 7 years, and the organism adjusts itself accordingly. Naturally, these are not crude happenings, they are delicate processes. But if a child grows up with an angry father or a hot-tempered teacher, then the vascular system, the blood vessels, will follow the line of the anger. The results of this implanted tendency in the early years will then remain through the whole rest of life. These are the things that matter most for young children. What you say, what you teach, does not yet make an impression, except in so far as children imitate what you say in their own speech. But it is what you are that matters. If you are good, this goodness will appear in your gestures, and if you are bad-tempered, this also will appear in your gestures. In short, everything that you do yourself passes over into the children and makes its way within them. This is the essential point. Children are wholly sense organ, and react to all the impressions of the people around them. Therefore, the essential thing is not to imagine that children can learn what is good or bad, that they can learn this or that, but to know that everything that is done in their presence is transformed in their childish organisms into spirit, soul, and body. The health of children for their whole life depends on how you conduct yourself in their presence. The inclinations that children develop depends on how you behave in their presence. But all the things that you are usually advised to do with kindergarten children are quite worthless. The things that are introduced as kindergarten education are usually extraordinarily clever. You could be quite fascinated by the cleverness of what has been thought out for kindergartens in the course of the 19th century. The children certainly learn a great deal there. They almost learn to read. They are supplied with letters of the alphabet, which they have to fit into cut-out letters. It all looks very clever, and you can easily be tempted to believe that it really is something suitable for children. But it is of no use at all. It really has no value whatsoever, and the soul of the child is impaired by it. The child is damaged, even down into the body, right down into physical health. Such kindergarten methods breed weaklings in body and soul for later life. On the other hand, if you simply have the children there in the kindergarten and conduct yourselves so that they can imitate you, if you do all kinds of things that the children can copy out of their own inner impulse of soul, as they had been accustomed to do in pre-earthly existence, then indeed the children will become like yourself. But it is for you to see that you are worthy of this imitation. This is what you must pay attention to during the first 7 years of life, and not what you express outwardly in words as a moral idea. If you make a surly face, so that a child gets the impression you are a grumpy person, this harms the child for the rest of its life. This is why it is so important, especially for little children, that as a teacher you should enter very thoroughly into the observation of a human being and human life. What kind of school plan you make is neither here or there, nor there. What matters is what sort of a person you are. In our day it is easy enough to think out a curriculum, because everyone in our age is now so clever. I am not saying this ironically. In our day people really are clever. Whenever a few people get together and decide that this or that must be done in education, something clever always comes out of it. I have never known a stupid educational program. They are always very clever. But what is important is that you have people in the school who can work in the way I have indicated. You must develop this way of thinking, for an immense amount depends upon it, especially for that age or life epoch of children in which they are really entirely sense organ. After the change of teeth is completed, children are no longer a sense organ to the same degree as before. This is already diminishing between the 3rd and 4th year, but before then children have quite special peculiarities that are generally not known whatsoever. When you eat something sweet or sour, you perceive it on the tongue and palate. But when young children drink milk, they feel that taste of milk through their whole body, because they are also an organ of sense regarding taste. Young children taste with their whole body. There are many remarkable instances of this. Older children take their cue from grown-ups, and therefore at 15, 16, or 20, they are, nowadays, already blasé and have lost their freshness. But it is possible to find children in their earlier years who are still wholly sense organ, though life is not easy for such. I knew, for example, a small boy who, on being given something to eat that he knew he would enjoy, approached the delectable object not only with those organs with which a person generally approaches food, but he steered toward it with his hands and feet. He was in fact wholly an organ of taste. The remarkable thing is that in his 9th or 10th year he became a splendid eurythmist and developed a great understanding for eurythmy. So what he began by, quote, padding, close quote, up to his food as a little child was developed further in his will organs at a later age. I do not say these things jokingly, but to give you examples of how to observe. You very rarely hear people relating such things, but they are happening every moment. People fail to perceive these characteristic phenomena of life and only think about how to educate the young instead of observing life itself. Life is interesting in every detail, from morning till evening. The smallest things are interesting. Notice, for instance, how two people take a pear from a fruit bowl. No two people take the pear in the same way. It is always different. The whole character of a person is expressed in the way the pear is taken from the fruit dish and put on the plate, or straight into the mouth, as the case may be. If people would only cultivate more power of observation of this kind, the distressing things would not develop in schools that are unfortunately so often seen today. One scarcely sees a child now who holds a pen or pencil correctly. Most children hold them incorrectly, and it is because the teachers do not know how to observe the children properly. This is a very difficult thing to do, and it is not easy in the Waldorf school either, where drastic changes are frequently needed in the way the children hold their pencils or pens. You must never forget that the human being is a whole, and as such must acquire dexterity in all directions. Therefore, what teachers need is observation of life down to the minutest details. And if you especially like having formulated axioms, then take this as the first principle of a real art of education. You must be able to observe life in all its manifestations. You can never learn enough in this regard. Look at the children from behind, for instance. Some walk by planting the whole foot on the ground. Others trip along on their toes, and there can be every kind of differentiation between these two extremes. Yes, indeed, to educate a child, you must know quite precisely how the child walks. For children who tread on their heels show in this small physical characteristic that they were very firmly planted in life in their former incarnation, and were interested in everything in their former earth life. In such a case, you must draw as much as possible out of the child, for there are many things hidden away in children who walk strongly on their heels. On the other hand, the children who trip along, who scarcely use their heels in walking, have gone through their former earth life in a superficial way. You will not be able to get much out of these children, but when you are with them, you must make a point of doing a great many things yourself that they can copy. You should have experienced the changing of the teeth through careful observation like this. The fact that children were previously wholly sense-organ now enables them to develop above all the gift of fantasy and symbolism. And you must take this into consideration even in play. Our materialistic age sins terribly against this. Take, for example, the so-called beautiful dolls that are so often given to children these days. They have such beautifully formed faces, wonderfully painted cheeks, and even eyes with which they can go to sleep when laid down, real hair, and goodness knows what all. But this kills the fantasy of the child, for it leaves nothing to the imagination, and the child can take no great pleasure in it. But if you make a doll out of a napkin or a handkerchief with 2 ink spots for eyes, a dab of ink for a mouth, and some sort of arms, then with imagination the child can add a great deal to it. It is particularly good for children to be given the opportunity to add as much as possible to playthings out of their own fantasy. This enables children to develop a symbolizing activity. Children should have as few things as possible that are finished and complete and what people call beautiful. For the beauty of such a doll that I have described above, with real hair and so on, is only a conventional beauty. In truth, it is ugly, because it is so inartistic. Do not forget that around the change of teeth, children pass over into the period of imagination and fantasy. It is not the intellect, but fantasy that fills life at this age. You, as teachers, must also be able to develop this life of fantasy, and those who bear a true knowledge of the human being in their souls are able to do this. It is indeed so that the true knowledge of the human being loosens and releases the inner life of soul and brings a smile to the face. Sour and grumpy faces come only from lack of knowledge. Certainly a person can have a diseased organ that leaves traces of illness on the face. This does not matter, for the child is not affected by it. When the inner nature of a person is filled with a living knowledge of what the human being is, this will be expressed in his face, and this is what can make a really good teacher. And so, between the change of teeth and puberty, you must educate out of the very essence of imagination. For the quality that makes a child under 7 so wholly into a sense organ now becomes more inward. It enters the soul life. The sense organs do not think. They perceive pictures, or rather they form sense experiences they form pictures from the sense organs do not think. They perceive pictures, or rather they form pictures from the external objects. And even when the child's sense experiences have already a quality of soul, it is not a thought that emerges, but an image, albeit a soul image, an imaginative picture. Therefore, in your teaching you must work in pictures, in images. Now, you can work least of all in pictures if you are teaching children something that is really quite foreign to them. For example, the calligraphy of today is quite foreign to children, both in written or printed letters. They have no relation whatever to what is called an A. Why should they have a relation to an A? Why should they be interested in an L? These are quite foreign to them, this A, this L. Nevertheless, when children come to school, they are taught these things, with the result that they feel no contact with what they are doing. And if they are taught this before the change of teeth, and are obliged to stick letters into cut-out holes, for example, then they are given things that are outside their nature, and to which they have not the slightest relationship. But what you should appeal to is what the children do possess now, an artistic sense, a faculty for creating imaginative pictures. It is to this you must turn. You should avoid a direct approach to the conventional letters of the alphabet that are used in writing and printing. Rather, you should lead the children in a vivid and imaginative way through the various stages that humanity has passed through in the history of civilization. In former times, there was picture writing. That is to say, people painted something on the page that reminded them of the object. You do not need to study the history of civilization, but you can show children the meaning and spirit of what people wanted to express in picture writing. Then children will feel at home in their lessons. For example, let us take the word Munt, mouth. Get the children to draw a mouth, or rather paint it. Let them put on dabs of red color, and then tell them to pronounce the word. You can say to them, don't pronounce the whole word at first, but begin only with the sound M. And now you can form the letter M out of the upper lip. There's a drawing. If you follow this process, you can get the letter M out of the mouth that the children first painted. This is how writing really originated, even though today it is difficult to recognize from the words themselves that the letters were once pictures, because the words have all been subject to change in the course of the evolution of speech. Originally, each sound had its own image, and each picture could have but one meaning. You do not need to go back to these original characters, but you can invent ways and means of your own. The teacher must be inventive and must create out of the spirit of the thing. Take the word fish. Let the children draw or paint some kind of fish. Let them say the beginning of the word F, and you can gradually get the letter F out of the picture. See the drawing. And thus, if you are inventive, you can find pictures for all the consonants. They can be worked out from a kind of painting drawing or drawing painting. This is more awkward to deal with than the methods of today, for it is of course necessary that after the children have been doing this painting for an hour or two, you have to clear it all away. But it just has to be so. There is nothing else to be done. So you can see how the letters can be developed out of the pictures, and the pictures again directly out of life. This is the way you must do it. On no account should you teach reading first, but proceeding from your drawing painting and painting drawing, you allow the letters to arise out of these, and then you can proceed to reading. If you look around, you will find plenty of objects that you can use to develop the consonants in this way. All the consonants can be developed from the initial letters of the words describing these objects. It is not so easy with the vowels, but perhaps for the vowels the following is possible. Suppose you say to the children, "Look at the beautiful sun. You must really admire it. Stand like this so that you can look up and admire the glorious sun." The children can stand, look up, and then express their wonder thus, "Ah." Then you paint this gesture, and you actually have the Hebrew ah, the sound of wonder. Now you need only make it smaller and gradually turn it into the letter A. There's a drawing. And so if you bring before the children something of an inner soul quality, and above all what is expressed in eurythmy, letting them take up one position or another, then you can also develop the vowels in the way I have mentioned. Eurythmy will be a very great help to you, because the sounds are already formed in the eurythmy gestures and movements. Think, for instance, of an O. You embrace something lovingly. Out of this you can obtain the O. There's a drawing. You can really get the vowels from the gesture, the movement. Thus you must work out of observation and imagination. And the children will then come to know the sounds and the letters from the things themselves. You must start from the picture. The letter, as we know it today in its finished form, has a history behind it. It is something that has been simplified from a picture. But the kind of magical signs of the printed letters of the present day no longer tell us what the pictures were like. When the Europeans, these quote-unquote better men, went to America, at the time when the quote-unquote savages, the native Indians, were still there, even in the middle of the 19th century such things happened, they showed these savages printed writing, and the Indians ran away from it, because they thought the letters were little devils. And they said, "The pale faces, as the Indians called the Europeans, communicate with each other by means of little devils, little demons." This is just what letters are for children. They mean nothing to them. The child feels something demonic in the letters, and rightly so. They already become a means of magic because they are merely signs. You must begin with the picture. That is not a magic sign, but something real, and you must work from this. People will object that the children then learn to read and write too late. This is said only because it is not known today how harmful it is when the children learn to read and write too soon. It is a very bad thing to be able to write early. Reading and writing as we have them today are really not suited to the human being till a later age, the 11th or 12th year, and the more a child is blessed with not being able to read and write well before this age, the better it is for the later years of life. A child who cannot write properly at 13 or 14, parenthesis, I can speak out of my own experience because I could not do it at that age, close parenthesis, is not so hindered for later spiritual development as one who, early, at 7 or 8 years, can already read and write perfectly. These are things that the teacher must notice. Naturally, you will not be able to proceed as you really should today, because the children have to pass from your independent school into public life. But a great deal can be done, nevertheless, when you know these things. It is a question of knowledge. And your knowledge must show you, above all, that it is quite wrong to teach reading before writing. In writing, especially if it is developed from the painting, drawing, painting that I have spoken of, the whole human being is active. The fingers take part, the body is positioned, the whole person is engaged. In reading, only the head is occupied, and anything that only occupies a part of the organism and leaves the remaining parts impassive should be taught as late as possible. It is most important first to bring the whole being into movement, and later on the single parts. Naturally, if you want to work in this way, you cannot expect to be given instructions for every detail, but only an indication of the path to be followed. And so you can build on nothing else but absolute freedom in this method of education arising out of anthroposophy, though this freedom must include the free creative fancy of the teacher and educator. In the Waldorf school, we have been blessed with what I might call a very questionable success. We began with 130 to 140 pupils, but these pupils came from the industrial works of Emil Molt, so they were at that time to a certain extent compulsory children, though we had also some children from anthroposophical families. In the short time of its existence, the Waldorf school has grown so big that we have now more than 800 children and between 40 and 50 teachers. This is a doubtful success, because gradually it becomes impossible to keep a clear view of the whole. From the arrangements of the Waldorf school that I shall describe to you, you will soon see how difficult it is to survey the whole, though I shall later indicate certain ways of making this possible. We have had to form parallel classes. In the case of the 5th and 6th, there are 3 parallel classes, A, B, and C. These classes are still over full and have more children than the other classes in the school. There is, therefore, a teacher in Class A, another in Class B. Just imagine how this would work out in a proper educational establishment of today. You come into Class 1A, where you find a particular educational drill going on that is considered the best. Now you go into Class 1B. It could equally well be called A, only that different children are sitting there. For in both classes, exactly the same thing goes on, because the quote-unquote right method is used. This is, of course, all most clearly thought out. What is intellectual has but one meaning, and it cannot be otherwise. With us in the Waldorf school, you find no such thing. You go into the first Class A. There you see a teacher, man or woman, who is teaching writing. The teacher lets the children make all kinds of forms, let us say with string. They then go on to painting the forms, and gradually letters arise. A second teacher likes to do it differently. If you go into Class B, you find that this teacher is letting the children dance the forms round the room, in order that they may experience the forms of the letters in their own bodies. Then this teacher carries over these forms also into the letters themselves. You would never find uniformity of teaching in Classes A, B, and C. The same things are taught, but in completely different ways, for a free creative imagination pervades the class. There are no prescribed rules for teaching in the Waldorf school, but only one unifying spirit that permeates the whole. It is very important that you understand this. Teachers are autonomous. Within this one unifying spirit, they can do entirely what they think is right for themselves. You will say, yes, but if everyone can do as they like, then the whole school will fall into a chaotic condition. For in Class 5A there could be goodness knows what kind of hocus-pocus going on, and in 5B you might find them playing chess. But that is exactly what does not happen in the Waldorf school. For though there is freedom everywhere, the spirit that is appropriate to the age of the children is active in each class. If you read the seminar course, you will see that you have the greatest liberty, and yet the teaching in each class is what is right for that age. Footnote: just before the opening of the Waldorf School in 1919, Dr. Steiner gave 3 simultaneous courses of lectures to the teachers, 2 of which have been published in English under the titles of Study of Man and Practical Advice to Teachers, and also the third has been, I believe it's called Discussions with Teachers. End of footnote. The strange thing is that no teacher has ever opposed this. They all quite voluntarily accept this principle of a unifying spirit in the work. No one opposes it or wants to have any special arrangements made. On the contrary, the wish is often expressed by the teachers to have as many discussions as possible in their meetings about what should be done in the various classes. Why does no teacher object to the curriculum? The school has been going for several years. Why do you think that all the teachers approve of the curriculum? They do not find it at all unreasonable. They find it excellent in its very freedom, because it is based upon real, true human knowledge. And the freedom that must prevail in the school can be seen in just such things as creating teaching matter out of imagination. Indeed, it does. All of our teachers have the feeling that it is not only a question of what they think about and discover out of their own imagination, but when I sit with our Waldorf teachers in their meetings, or when I go into the classes, I get more and more the impression that once the teachers are in their classrooms, they actually forget that a plan of teaching has previously been drawn up. What I experience when I go into the classes is that in the moment of teaching, each teacher feels that he or she is creating the plan of work. Such is the result when real human knowledge lies at the basis of the work. I tell you these details even though you might think they were said out of vanity. Indeed, they are not said out of vanity, but so you know how it is, and then go and do likewise. This will show you how what grows out of a true knowledge of the human being can really enter into the child. Our teaching and education is to be built then on imagination. You must be quite clear that before the 9th or 10th year, the child does not know how to differentiate itself as an ego from its surroundings. Out of a certain instinct, children have long been accustomed to speak of themselves as I, capital, but in truth they really feel themselves within the whole world. However, people have the most fantastic ideas about this. They say of primitive races that their feeling for the world is animism, that is, they treat lifeless objects as though they were ensouled. They say that to understand children, you must imagine that they do the same as these primitive peoples, that a child knocks against a hard object to endow it with the quality of soul. But this is not at all true. In reality, children do not ensoul the object, but they do not yet distinguish between the living and the lifeless. For children, everything is one, and they are also one with their surroundings. Not until the age of 9 or 10 do children really learn to distinguish themselves from their environment. This is something you must take into consideration in the strictest sense to give your teaching a proper basis. Therefore, it is important to speak of everything that is around the children, plants, animals, and even stones, in a way that all these things talk to each other, that they act among themselves like human beings, that they tell each other things, that they love and hate each other. You must learn to use anthropomorphism in the most inventive ways, and speak of plants and animals as though they were human. You must not ensoul them out of a kind of theory, but treat them simply in a way that children can understand, before they are able to distinguish between the lifeless and the living. As yet, the child has no reason to think that the stone has no soul, whereas the dog has a soul. The first noticeable difference is that the dog moves, but the child does not attribute this movement to the fact that the dog has a soul. Indeed, you can treat all things that feel and live as if they were people, thinking, feeling, and speaking to one another, as if they were people with sympathy and antipathy for each other. Therefore, Everything that you bring to a child of this age must be given in the form of fairy tales, legends, and stories in which everything is endowed with feeling. It must be kept in mind that nourishing the instinctive soul qualities of imagination in this way is the best foundation for the child's soul life. If you fill the child with all kinds of intellectual teaching during this age, and this will be the case if you do not transform everything you teach into pictures, then later the child will suffer effects in the blood vessels and circulation. You must consider the child in body, soul, and spirit as an absolute unity. This must be said repeatedly. For this task, as a teacher, you must have artistic feeling in your soul and an artistic disposition. It is not only what you think out or what you can convey in ideas that works from teacher to child, but if I may express myself so, it is the imponderable quality in life. A great deal passes over from teacher to child unconsciously. The teacher must be aware of this, above all when telling fairy tales, stories, or legends full of feeling. It can often be noticed in our materialistic times how a teacher does not really believe what he or she is telling and looks on it as something childish. It is here that anthroposophy can be the guide and leader of a true knowledge of the human being. We become aware through anthroposophy that we can express a thing infinitely more fully and more richly if we clothe it in pictures than if we put it into abstract ideas. A child who is healthy naturally feels the need to express everything in pictures, and also to receive everything in picture form. In this way, Goethe learned to play the piano as a boy. He was shown how he had to use the first finger, the second finger, and so on, but he did not like this method, and his dry, pedantic teacher was repugnant to him. Father Goethe was an old Philistine, one of the old pedants of Frankfurt, who naturally preferred to engage Philistine teachers, because they were the good ones, as everyone knew. But this kind of teaching was repugnant to the boy Goethe. It was too abstract. So he invented for himself the Deuterling, the little fellow who points. Not index finger, that was too abstract, but Deuterling. Children want an image, and want to think of themselves as an image too. It is just in these things that we see how the teacher needs to use imagination, to be artistic, for then the teacher will meet the children with a truly living quality of soul, and this living quality works upon the children in an imponderable way, imponderable in the best sense. Through anthroposophy you learn once more to believe in legends, fairy tales, and myths, for they express a higher truth in imaginative pictures. And your handling of these fairy tales, legends, and mythical stories will once more be filled with a quality of soul. Then when you speak to the child, your very words, permeated by your own beliefs in the tales, will carry truth with them, whereas it is so often untruth that passes between teacher and child. Truth will flow between you and the child. Let me read that again. Whereas it is so often untruth that passes between teacher and child, truth will flow between you and the child. Untruth at once holds sway if the teacher says, "Children are stupid. I am clever. Children believe in fairy tales, so I have to tell fairy tales to them." It's the proper thing for them to hear. When a teacher speaks like this, then an intellectual element immediately enters into the storytelling. But children, especially at the age between the change of teeth and puberty, are most sensitive as to whether teachers are governed by imagination or intellect. The intellect has a destructive and crippling effect on children. Imagination gives children life and impulses. It is vital that you make these fundamental thoughts your own. I will speak of them in greater detail during the next few days, but there is one more thing I would like to put before you in conclusion. Something especially important happens to children between the ages of 9 and 10. Speaking in an abstract way, it can be said that children learn to differentiate themselves from their environment. Children feel themselves as an I, capital, and the environment is something external that does not belong to this I. But this is an abstract way of expressing it. The reality is that, speaking of course in a general sense, the child of this age approaches you with some problem or difficulty. In most cases the child will not actually speak of what is burdening its soul, but will say something different. All the same, you have to know this really comes from the innermost depths of the child's soul. And then you must find the right approach, the right answer. An enormous amount depends on this for the whole future life of the child concerned. For you cannot work with children of this age as their teacher unless you are yourself the unquestioned authority, unless, that is, the children have the feeling, this is true because you hold it to be true, this is beautiful because you find it beautiful, and this is good because you think it good. And therefore you are pointing these things out. You must be for the children the representative of the good, the true, and the beautiful. The children must be drawn to truth, goodness, and beauty, simply because the children are drawn to you yourself. And then, in between the 9th and 10th year, a feeling arises instinctively in the child's subconsciousness. I get everything from my teacher, but where does my teacher get it from? What is behind my teacher? If you then go into definitions and explanations, it will only do harm. It is important to find a loving word, a word filled with warmth of heart, or rather many words, for these difficulties can go on for weeks and months, so that you can avert this danger and preserve the child's confidence in your authority. For the child has now come to a crisis regarding the principle of authority. If you can meet the situation and can preserve your authority by the warmth of feeling with which you deal with these particular difficulties, if you can meet the child with inner warmth, sincerity, and truth, then much will be gained. The child will retain its belief in your authority, and that is good for the child's further education. But it is also essential that just at this age, between 9 and 10, the child's belief in a good person does not waver. Were this to happen, then the inner security that should be the child's guide through life will totter and sway. This is of very great significance and must constantly be remembered. In handbooks on education, you find all kinds of intricate details laid down for the guidance of teachers, but it is of far greater importance to know what happens at a certain point in a child's life and how you should act with regard to it, so that through your action you may radiate light onto the child's whole life. The end of Lecture 2.